Hello, welcome to this lecture. Um, I decided I would give you a supplementary lecture on empires because uh, we're talking mainly about primary state formation in this course. And in other words, primary state formation can be thought of as a state that, whatever definition you want to use for that, a state that was formed in the context of no other states having come before it. So it's the first of its kind. It's a sort of an organic growth and development from an earlier pre-state or non-state society, perhaps a chiefdom or a tribal society, into one that has a more rigid hierarchical structure, uh, complex division of labors, and cities and state level territoriality, including things like the concept of kingship, state religions, and all the things that we're talking about in terms of how Gordon Childe tried to come up with a list of criteria for this. But as you may be well aware, human cultures don't stop just at states. There are larger and more complex cultures on top of state level identity. In fact, one that we call empires, and we don't focus very much on that. But when we get to the Incan civilization in the Andes, we'll see that that actually probably can be defined as an empire. Now, so I figured it was time when we're studying Mesopotamian cultures that we might as well delve into this, because when you think of empire, you often think of, okay, perhaps most recently things like the British Empire, but you might also think of things like the Roman Empire. But all of these things have precursors going back to, once again, the Middle East, where we find a lot of the innovations that uh, we see in later, especially European cultures, finding their roots in Middle Eastern culture. And so the first empire, where is that found? Is that the Roman Empire the first empire? Well, certainly not. There were plenty before then. So how far back can we go before we can see the first empire starting to form? First of all, let's ask ourselves, what is an empire? And so I've got some definitions here. An aggregate of nations or people ruled over by an emperor or other powerful sovereign or government, usually a territory of greater extent than a kingdom. But it can be made of solely contiguous territories, so it's just one big territory, or of territories that are farther remote from one another, which we often refer to as colonialism. And the economic strategies employed can be different depending. So there's not just one definition of how an empire uh, um, uh, subsists. So I mentioned imperialism is not exactly the same thing as colonialism, although they're related concepts. Imperialism operates from a center, and there's a state policy which is developed for ideological as well as financial reasons. So you know that you're part of this empire. You're not just participating in an economic system. You are told, you might even be quite proud of being an empire, but you might very well not have a choice about it. Colonialism is simply the development for settlement or commercial intentions. So you can have a brand new settlement put into place as a colony someplace, or you might attach a portion of a settlement to a pre-existing one as a colonial enclave. So colonialism in modern usage also intends to imply a degree of geographic separation between the colony and an imperial power. Edward Said, the very famous sociologist uh, and historian, wrote that imperialism involves the practice, the theory, and the attitudes of a dominating metropolitan center ruling a distant territory, while colonialism refers to the implanting of settlements on a distant territory. And I think that's an important thing. If we're talking about empire, imperialism, the practice, the theory, and the attitudes of a dominating metropolitan center ruling a distant territory. So what is the first place that where we see imperialism? Often it's stated that the Akkadian Empire is the first empire, but there is some debate as to whether it's a true empire or an expansion of a socioeconomic identity. Is it economic expansion? I participate with Yale University's Akkadian Empire project. I'm a member of the staff on the Tel Leilan excavation project. I'm working on some of the artifacts that come from there, and we're going to take a look at that because I have a perspective on this that I think is informative and might help us understand whether the Akkadian Empire should and can be thought of as a true empire. And Tel Leilan, also known in the ancient world as Shechna, they're also making up what are called the Chabur triangle is Tel Leilan, Tel Brak, ancient Nagar, and Tel Mozan, ancient Urkesh. And this is located in the Middle East in what is now modern. These three sites are all in modern Syria, northeastern Syria, not far from the border of Iraq. If you can see my cursor here, that we're right about there, right in the middle of the Middle East. And this is where, as you've seen from previous lessons, where we've seen a lot of early developments taking place, early agriculture, early farming and herding, early aggregated settlements and sedentism, and then early examples of things like writing, administration, and the development of cities. So Akkad, the empire of Akkad, traces its roots back to a person, a man named Sargon, Sargon of Akkad, or Sargon the Great. And Sargon reigned was the king of a city called Akkad in southern Mesopotamia. So in modern Iraq, we actually don't know where Akkad is. We don't know where the capital of the Akkadian Empire is. We have a general idea from ancient texts of where it's supposed to be, but it's never really been discovered. Sargon would have been born outside of the Akkadian Empire, right? Because if he established this empire, it had to happen sometime during his reign. And so the Sargonic period is like the formation of the Akkadian Empire. And then he had children that then followed in his footsteps as being the ruler of Akkad, and underwent various stages of expansion of their power, not just in their city, in their locality, not just in their region, but actually outside of their region to take over other regions. And we're going to look at that a little bit here. But it brings up a question that I've brought up before. The timing of these events, if I can use air quotes here, it's very facile to say that here is Sargon starts the Akkadian Empire, and then he has these many sons that rule over that, and then suddenly it collapses. There are events don't fully explain, like single moments in time don't fully explain the way that life works. It's a much messier thing that how large is the Akkadian Empire at any moment? Well, it depends on how much people buy into the concept of being part of that empire, or how much they're coerced or forced to be part of that empire. Can you have a colony far off and then very little in between? Does that mean that everywhere in between is part of your empire, or is it just that little colony that you've set up over there? So the geography, the timing, the nature of an empire is something that requires a little nuance to understand. So Manishtushu in particular was the favored, the person who took over from his father Sargon, and he reigned for 15 years. And then the very famous Naram Sin, from which we get a curse later on, and all sorts of mythology written about him. We'll talk about Naram Sin in a moment. And then several other sons, Sharkalashari, and then Dudu and Shudurul, who had various levels of success in keeping this empire together. So Manishtushu here, we have the stele of Manishtushu, was very successful in maintaining and even expanding on Sargon's original spread. We're going to see some maps in a moment. And then we have Naram Sin, who uh, part of the mythology around Naram Sin, which has been borne out a little bit in the archaeological record, is that he had great hubris, that he started to make himself into a god. And you can see this image here of Naram Sin stepping on his enemies, his defeated enemies, holding an axe, and looking very powerful and much larger than all of his foes. But you can see he's actually dressed like a human here. But he did one great sin. Here's some more pictures of Naram Sin. And do I have a picture of the stele? I'm not sure if I do. Oh, that's a shame. The stele of Naram Sin I don't have. That's very strange. Anyway, the Naram Sin began to show himself depicted as a god, wearing horns, which only gods would do, and this is interpreted by later mythologizers, later storytellers, to be a great sin that Naram Sin condemned himself to, and this brought upon a curse upon Akkad and the downfall of the empire, and a curse on their people. So the curse of Akkad relates to Naram Sin thinking himself a god and rising above his station, depicting himself in ways that put himself onto the gods, which didn't bode well for him. Now we're going to come back to that in a little bit, because it's a way to explain some of the things that happened to what was once probably thought of as an undefeatable empire. So the Akkadian Empire territory, this map shows sort of roughly where we are, and you can see up Urkesh and Nagar and Tel Eilan is in that same area, just outside of the territory under the authority of the Akkadian Empire. But there were some additional areas that Sargon and Manishtushu and Naram Sin actually extended beyond that. And then later on, Sharkalashari took over the neighboring region to the south east of Elam, which is now in modern day Iran. And you can see this map here showing the rainfall. This is a rainfall map. And you can see that Tel Mozan, Tel Eilan, and Tel Brak all exist in an area where there's rain-fed agriculture. It's very rich and lush. It's sort of the breadbasket of the Middle East. So those sites up there, Ebla, Mozan, Leilan, Brak, Nineveh, all of these are dry farming locations. They don't need irrigation. But you go further south and it's far too dry. The rain just doesn't fall enough to support crop agriculture. And you can see in italics, because we don't know exactly where it is, but Akkad is the imperial capital of the Akkadian Empire, but it would have been in dry farming regions. There's a limit to how much you can grow in irrigation agriculture land, which all of those red dots down there show that would have been their economy. So a large and expanding population at a capital like Akkad may have very well been interested in taking over, or at least exerting influence or trading with areas to the far north that had rain-fed agriculture and perhaps more productivity in terms of staple agriculture. But up in that area, it was a different group of people. You had Hurrian language, you had Hurrian people, you had the Amuru in around Ebla. This is the Egyptians, of course, were on this map. We don't need to talk about them right now. And then the Elamite kingdoms over to the east as well. So the Akkadians weren't the only game in town. But it seems as though through military conquest in particular, but probably a little bit of diplomacy and negotiation, as we'll see with especially Urkesh, there may have been different strategies to establish your dominance over a region, or at least maybe not dominance, but a cooperation. It seems as though with some sites, Nagar, Tel Brak, and Tel Leilan, taking over might have been the option. But in a place like Urkesh, it seems as though diplomacy was probably preferable, as we'll see from some of the evidence there. So in southern Mesopotamia, we have establishment of very strong centralized processes like religions. You have a redistributive economy, which means all productivity is brought into a central place and then redistributed out. So you don't own what you produce. It goes to the state, and then the state compensates you for what you provide. And these are all very hyper specialized. You have your own type of job. And grain production is the primary driving force of the economy. But as I said before, large and expanding cities need more and more food. So you expand. But how do you do that? You need to establish authority, and you still have to maintain over that centralized control. So things like religion, we see ziggurats, which are sort of like Mesopotamian, well, they're temples, but they're kind of truncated, they're not pyramidal in shape, but they're sort of a similarity to what we see in terms of the size of pyramids in Egypt. They're temples rather than tombs, though. And the ziggurat at Ur, very famous. This is a reconstruction that you can see in the background there. That was probably first built under Shark el-Ashari. And so they're establishing all sorts of ideological systems that bring people under this very tightly controlled umbrella. When they expanded, however, as I said, there were different strategies to how they would deal with people that weren't under their territory, that didn't speak their language, that didn't have their same customs. And so if you want to grow and expand into an empire, how do you deal with those cultures and communities that aren't one of your own? Do they just fall over and allow you to take them over? Or is there a fight, or is there some kind of a negotiation? At Tel Mozan, otherwise known as Urkesh, the ancient name, this seems to have been a capital of a Hurrian kingdom, and it had a strong enough identity that they probably retained their autonomy and identity. And it seems as though Naram Sin took the negotiation strategy here and married off his daughter, Taram Akkad, into the Hurrian royal family. And so this is a good way to just say, look, we're now family. You know, I don't dominate you, but we're gonna relate here because my daughter is now your son's wife, and so that means your son, your heir apparent, is my son-in-law, right? So we're related to one another now. This is things that you see in European kingdoms later on in historical periods as well. This is marriage relation is a good way to smooth over what could otherwise be a fight, right? So you marry into one another, and then suddenly you're all family. You can still fight, but it's on a different relation. You're not. It's not. It takes a lot to then go and invade. But you also mean that there's preferential treatment in terms of things like trade. And it seems as though at Tel Brak, ancient Nagar, they took a different strategy. They didn't try and dominate Tel Brak. It seems like that was a pretty cohesive culture too. But what they did is they set up a citadel. They put an administrative center in the middle of their acropolis, the top of their city, and just said, look, this is our trading post, and we're going to start taking taxes from you, or we're going to be controlling the way that you trade. They're not trying to dominate culturally. They're not trying to do a very top-down approach. They just have an installation of an administrative center in what is otherwise an indigenous northern Mesopotamian site. And then Tel Leilan, which is the site that I work at with Yale University, it seems as though early on, they traded with Akkad, but they retained autonomy during some of these early periods with perhaps Sargon, Naram Sin, and right down to probably Dudu, where it is finally, we think, taken over during Dudu's reign, one of the last kings of the Akkadian Empire. It seems, and I'll show you some of the evidence for why we think they retained their own autonomy, but then finally were taken over in some of the late stages of the Akkadian expansion. So one of the things that we see in empires is you have a palatial economy. So things are very top down. The palace has records and administration. But you also, that doesn't mean that they know what's happening in your household, and it doesn't mean that they have completely rejected all entrepreneurship, that people can't be employed as traders. So there's sort of multiple different types of economies. The palatial economy is very top down. It probably thinks that it controls everything, but it doesn't control all private, as we call in archaeology, oikos economy, or just small scale household economy, right? So you're doing things under the table that maybe doesn't get taxed. There's also the temple economy as well. And that's an ideological function that holds together groups of people that may have different languages, may have different backgrounds, but if you're all focusing on the same gods, then you're part of the same group. And they also participated in economic activities as well. And this ideology then justifies taxation, that if you're all part of the same group, both palace or if your roads and safety is maintained by the state and your donations to the gods are keeping the rains coming, that gives justification for you giving your product over to the centralized state. Here's what I was talking about. Now this is Naram Sin and the very famous stele of Naram Sin, where very similar to earlier depictions of Naram Sin, but this is him with horns. And this is, and it shows him going up toward the mountain. You can see here, he is climbing the mountain with the celestial bodies up here, and that is the domain of the gods. He's much larger than everybody else, and everyone following him, his supplicants are following him with banners, and he is defeating his enemies. This may be well, it's clearly hubris. It is clearly putting himself into the role of a god. Perhaps the first time ever that a human being that we know who is a real human being started calling himself a god. That may be predated in Egypt, probably so, but this is a very clear Mesopotamian example of that association of or attribution of godhood. And here's a cylinder seal showing those same types of horns, actually multi-horns, and mountaintops, and the scale of being much larger than other creatures. And this is actually just a group of gods that are all doing stuff on a cylinder seal. And so you can see here in Naram Sin's depiction, he's also showing himself in a similar depiction as you would have for gods. So images of power are important because it then gives esteem to the palatial court, that the palace isn't just controlled by a powerful person, it's actually Naram Sin as a god now. And depictions of wealth that your state has. When your taxes go to build giant palaces or temples, it gives you pride. You say, yes, we're doing pretty well in this state. And also you want to say, we are strong and we can defend ourselves. And we can defend you as well and your property and your livelihood. And we have divine, the divine okay as well, that the gods are on our side. So there are various aspects that we as archaeologists try to look into: the palace, private enterprise and trade, military temples. So let's take a look at some of that when we get into the information from Tel Leilan. But before we do that, it's an interesting question as to whether an empire needs some kind of a god like this, because with a pluralistic empire, you've got different groups of people, you've got different languages, you've got different backgrounds. A pluralistic empire is divisive, and it's always sort of on a knife edge. It's tenuous. And so Naram Sin may have done this not just because he's prideful and he thinks he's a god, but it could have been consolidating power through this symbolism, that they needed a figurehead that was larger than just a king, but a god king. And the temple, the palace, the trade, agricultural production was all then brought under this umbrella of a god king. And that established and gave the approval to a homogeneous bureaucratic system, which is something that you need over a large territory. Because empires are intrinsically fragile. They're made up of multiple groups of people that any of them could just revolt and cause problems at any time. Also, unity on a large scale like this can create over specialization. We're going to look at one of the problems of that. Also, when everything relies upon having a central figurehead, that cult of personality also produces fragility in that system, because what happens when that person who's really holding everything together as a figurehead dies or is disgraced or something like that? So linking that to one individual means that there's a lifespan to that aspect of unification. So the Curse of Akkad is a later document, as I've mentioned, where it's reported that Naram Sin destroys the god Enlil's temple in Nippur because he's very prideful. And Enlil is not very the god Enlil is not very happy about this and sends disaster, famine onto the land. And the other gods curse Akkad to save the rest of humanity from his wrath. So Enlil's on a tear, and the gods are like, all right, hold back, Enlil, we'll just punish Akkad. Akkad will be no more. It will fall forever as long as you save the rest of humanity. So let's look at the Akkadian Empire project. This is Harvey Weiss here. He's the director of, he's a professor at Yale University and has published some very important work on this site that he's been digging since 1978. I joined the project in the early 2000s and have been working there ever since. This site, Tel Leilan, we're going to look at fairly carefully. It's situated right here. And this is a topographical map of the site. It's quite large. It was a city, and we're going to look at some of the chronology there. We're going to look especially at Operation CG up here, and the Acropolis northwest, which we're calling the Dudu Palace. There's some other ones. Shamshi-Adad we will not pay attention to here because that's a later time period, but a very interesting one. So state formation in the third millennium. In the fourth millennium, so the 3000s BC, there was contact with the southern Mesopotamian Uruk civilization, which we've talked about in previous lectures. And so it's often thought that secondary state formation took place with rapid urbanization in the Jazeera region around, which is where Tel Leilan is, around 2600 BC. There was indigenous culture there, and in fact, it was actually quite large population agglomerations, but it does seem as though some of the lessons from what was taking place in the south with large, huge cities and temples and that sort of thing was having an impact about 2600 BC in the north as well. And this can be seen in some of the administrative objects. I specialize in seals, seal impressions, which we call glyptic objects, that have designs, artistic designs, and some of them are indigenous designs, but you see at this time period an increasing number of southern Mesopotamian motifs, designs coming into that. And in the second half of the third millennium, you start to see the Akkadian Empire spreading into this area, dominating it to some extent. We've already looked at Mosan and Tel Brak, and we're going to look at what happened at Tel Leilan. And so the time period we're talking about here is from about 2600 down to about 2200 BC. What we call at Tel Leilan periods 3D, which is the earliest, through 2A, which is the pre-Akkadian Bronze Age, and then 2B, which is the Akkadian period. I've mentioned this before. It's very easy to think of time periods as breaking down into blocks of time. So you have the Ninevite 5, you have EB, Early Bronze Age 2, you have the Early Bronze 3, you have the Akkadian period, you have the post-Akkadian period. But things don't just happen like you're checking your watch and you say, okay, we're all Akkadian now, change all of your letterhead on your stationery. It doesn't work that way. And we tend to, in archaeology, when we gloss over things, it's just a territorial expansion through from one color to the next color. But that's not really how it works, because different sites can take on different characteristics, and they can be have different relations at different times. And so that's what the timing becomes extremely crucial, not just what you're looking at, but when you're looking at it. And thankfully for Tel Leilan, we have some of the best dated materials for this entire region. And in fact, many other sites are really trying to catch up with how well we can date this process, when this happened. So, and then you can also have when societies break down, you can have the collapse of empires as well is something that you have to watch, not just as a wave of changing back from one color to another. You can have that in different phases as well. And as we'll see, Tel Mosan seems to have been consistent throughout, maybe perhaps because they were not dominated, but they were negotiating and were family members with the Akkadian Empire. So Tel Leilan, here's a aerial photography of Tel Leilan from the 1930s, I think, maybe 40s. And you can see here, this is how large it is. This is the lower town, and then red is the Acropolis. This is the Acropolis Northwest that we're going to look at, and this is the city gate, which we'll also look at. I excavated this, I think, in 2002. This was bulldozed accidentally by some roadworks, and so they had damaged some of the site. And this is through the outer city walls. You can see the Acropolis in the background there. And so, to making most of the damage, we just cleaned it up and tried to salvage what we could, and it gave us an opportunity to understand in a very small location the sequence of events that took place at the city gate area. And as you might imagine, at a city gate, there were limited activities taking place there. There was fortifications, which we established were put down in right at about 2600 BC at the period 3D. And then you have a series of interior deposits and a rebuilding in the 2B period, and then spaces and features inside, followed by a complete abandonment of the site that we call the hiatus, the Habur hiatus. And you can see these sequence of interior spaces here, which are mostly big fire installations. And what do you find there? It's mostly administrative stuff. And so you can think of this as like a guardhouse that the walls aren't just protecting you from invaders, it's also channeling resources that if you're a trader, you have to come through the gate and people are going to check what you have, and they're going to tax you, they're going to send you on to the proper place to put to do your trading. So walls don't just keep people out, they actually help people in, but in exactly the way that you want them to. So control means that you want to administer things. And so administrative residue, things like seals, seal impressions, tokens, those are the dominant artifacts that we see at the city gate. And interestingly, bags and baskets are the most of the type of sealings that you get. So when you seal and stamp or impress things to make sure that commodities are traded under and been taxed. The types of things that are being sealed at the city gate are bags and baskets. Those are transportable. Those aren't storerooms that are being controlled. Those are fixed locations. These are things that are probably coming in from the outside being transported in. And as you'll see, this is 3D and 2A. So this is all pre-Akkadian. And here's some of the seal impressions, and there's some pretty designs and things. And these are all local designs, which I'll show you in a moment. These are the reverse impressions, which tell you what was being sealed, bags, baskets, that sort of a thing. Also some figurines and some writing as well. And the type of pottery that you find there is almost entirely drinking vessels. So these were probably just soldiers or administrators having a cup of tea, waving people through customs and checking what was in their bags and breaking them open, saying, all right, we need to tax this. Okay, I'm going to reseal this and send you on. You need to go there and you need to go there, and sending people on their way. And this is all very squarely in this time period, about 26 to about 2400 BC. On the Acropolis Northwest, here's my crew working. This is the plan of what we've excavated in this area, or not all of it, but a large chunk that we were doing in 2006. And I'm going to break this apart a little bit here. Contemporary with what we just saw at the city gate in the pre-Akkadian periods, we don't have a lot on the Acropolis, but you can see this little keyhole excavation through the floor of the later Akkadian floor. This is the Akkadian floor. This is just through it. We got all sorts of administrative things like seal impressions and seals and things like that. Also from another portion of the site, just adjacent to this, we have a series of tannours or ovens that probably would have been processing grain, baking them a little bit so they stopped the germination process and they could be then transported. And so this limited period 2 exposure has some artifacts, and also we know what's going on. And these are the tannour rooms. This is where that keyhole excavation is right there. I'll point out this is the crenellated, an addition in the Akkadian period. I'll come back to that in a moment. And here's some more tannours there. And what we find in these early periods, or actually in all periods, are once again mostly administrative residue. Look at this, that's sealings there. So seal impressions, seals, but also it's mostly administrative or agricultural processing. Models are things like figurines. That's the second largest category. For complex reasons, I've argued that may also be for both ritual, perhaps religious, but also administrative function as well. So there's a limited range of things going here. This is not a household, this is the palace. And so administrative residue and food processing are the major things that are taking place there. So you've got food coming in, you've got grain, especially wheat, and barley coming through, especially wheat, and then getting accounted for. You have accountants. That's what is happening in there. And the reverse impressions, what is being sealed, rather than portable containers like bags and baskets at the city gate, you have doors. So these are show that these were being sealed over storerooms. And so things were making their way to the Acropolis, and then they were staying there until they were, that was where they were held. So for things like redistributive economy. And I'm just going to gloss over some of these things. But here's some of the period 2 and 3, 3D and 2A glyptic. So these are indigenous style designs. So these are northern Mesopotamian designs before the influence of the Akkadian Empire comes in. So I think the important thing to remember is Tel Eilan was a sophisticated city with its own leadership. It had their own artistic styles, they had their own mythology. For instance, this design that you see here is very similar to some that you see, I'll show you in a moment, from other areas, from other sites in the region, probably referring to some mythological scene that everybody would have known about. I mentioned animal figurines. These may very well have to do with breeding of particular types of animals for sale. And also there is evidence of kingship. This is a composite reconstruction on multiple things on what was probably a bull figurine made of clay, and it was sealed over several times. And I've come up with this composite reconstruction that shows a scene of some aristocrat, probably a king, sitting having beer, drinking through a straw, and attendants are pouring libations into that beer, pouring more beer into his hopper there. So this is a banqueting scene of some elite person. I mentioned before that these, from the city gate area, you see this seal impression that we saw earlier with this horned quadruped and a smaller quadruped underneath suckling, and then what's probably this is on the right-hand side, and probably a scorpion underneath. There's a person standing up next to what are upright, probably vegetal motifs, so like a tree or something, and holding a snake. And if you look on the one on the left, this is also, this is from the Acropolis, and it's the same design or the same scene, but in just a slightly rendered in a slightly more angular way. And you can see that these designs are found in other sites, Tel Brak, and also in the region Chagar Bazar. And so this scene is probably known. So prior to the Akkadian period, prior to the Akkadians coming in, there was a robust culture that Tel Brak, Tel Elan, Tel Mozan, Chagar Bazar, all these places were independent city-states probably that shared culture with one another, interacted with one another, but were then reacting to in various ways with an increasing influence from Akkad in the south. One of those influences is this. You don't find this scorpion man in the north. These animal protomes, these heads of animals that you see on this seal impression, also from the Acropolis, are very common, but this is the furthest north that you find this particular design of a mythological creature, scorpion man. So this is during this same time period that the indigenous northern Mesopotamian culture is thriving. They're starting to feel a little influence. They're picking up some little tricks from the south, and this is one of those. Also, we know that they had direct contact because this is a seal impression that does not come from the north. So this is in one of the later levels of the pre-Akkadian Acropolis, and this is a seal impression from a seal that almost certainly was carved in the south and was imported into the north. Here's a photograph of this, and we even think that we know the site where this was manufactured in the south, the site of Lagash. And this is in the particular style that's typical of the southern Mesopotamia. This just does not belong in the north, but they were using this as part of their own administration. This is on a door ceiling. So you can see that during this time, you're starting to have evidence of influence coming from Akkad in the south. So if think back to our timeline here, Sargon is starting to push the limits. Then Manishtushu and Naram Sin, they're pushing out, but this is not a takeover. So this is probably contemporary with the expansion of the Akkadian Empire, but Tel Elan has not been taken over. They're just still trading, and they're integrating Akkadian designs into their own way of doing things, their own administration. So this is still pre-Akkadian, but it's influenced by their local, there's a coexistence of their local styles, there's imitation styles, and there's also imported, fully imported Southern Mesopotamian seals. So this is a localized timeline here to Tel Elan. So we've got the 2B is pre-Akkadian, and you can see that there are, in the pre-Akkadian period, they're writing in Akkadian language, in Akkadian script. We're going to see that there's a scribal room with tablets that was a schoolhouse where they were teaching administrators how to write and how to account for things. And they started to develop these, these 2B is Akkadian period. So in the 2A period, you have a storeroom, you have your own indigenous religious practices taking place in the Acropolis. We also have their own indigenous, but influenced by Akkadian administration. And then you start to have the inclusion of the Akkadian tablet room. You have the pre-planned architecture, and then you have an administrative building, and we'll come to the unfinished building in a moment here. And so when after this, in the 2B period, you have this rebuilding of the Acropolis. I mentioned this crenellated base here. This is not manipulated in the photograph. This is just added in the Akkadian period to the pre-existing pre-Akkadian wall. And we'll see that in the top-down plan in a moment. This cultic platform was built upon. And so you can see this is that addition. They just reoriented everything. They made this street at a different angle. This is the pre-Akkadian street. This is the Akkadian street coming this way. They built a grain bin right here, and they had all sorts of work areas. They just were reconfiguring things in this 2B period. So is this Akkadian expansion? Well, let's look at the administration. Let's look at the seal impressions. This is totally different, and it may take an expert's eye to understand what you're looking at here, but let me just go through it. This here doesn't belong at all. This doesn't belong at all, and this doesn't belong at all. None of these are indigenous designs, and we'll take a look at some parallels. For instance, this one is written in Akkadian, and it says Hayobum Shabra, written in Akkadian script right here, and this is a hero that is being displayed. So there's a human figure, but this says Shabra, and a Shabra is a governor. So Hayobum was the governor now of Shechna, of ancient Tel Leilan, and written in Akkadian. So it seems pretty clear that at this point, Tel Leilan has been taken over, and Hayobum is their governor. What were they doing? Why did they come in and take over? What was Hayobum governing over? Well, it seems as though from a British Museum text, they talk about Nagar. We know that's Tel Brak, so not Tel Leilan, but very close to it. That incoming from Nagar, Tel Brak into Akkad was 40,000 liters of barley, 4,200 of emmer wheat, and some other portion of emmer wheat for Sipar, which is in southern Mesopotamia, from Nagar, which is Tel Brak, so from the north to the south, and Dada was the administrator who did that. So huge quantities of wheat and barley are being imported from the north down into the south. Centralized, redistributive economy that pretty convincingly sounds like an empire, doesn't it? And when does this happen at when does this dominance take over at Tel Leilan? Well, we saw Hayobum Shabra, but we saw this in Naram Sin's stele here. See that bent arm? That's very typical of Naram Sin or later. And also we have these horns on this from Tel Leilan 2B period. We have these horns that we've seen before depicting gods. So these are late Akkadian designs on the seal impressions. This is not the Akkadian Empire under Sargon or Naram Sin instantly taking over the north. It seems as though whatever happened at Tel Mozan, in Urkesh, or in Nagar Tel Brak, it was late Akkadian period, we think under the reign of Dudu, that one of the last Akkadian kings, that finally Tel Leilan had a governor installed there and was taken over entirely. They decided they were going to revamp the entire Acropolis, and they decided also that they were going to install some kind of a big, impressive building that they started to build right here of basalt blocks. These are giant black stones that are brought from far to the north, imported, and they start building what might have been some kind of a temple or a palatial structure or something, we don't know, because it was never finished. They started putting the mud bricks down on top of the stone foundations, and this is where they finished it. They did not complete it. And they abandoned the site. They just packed up and moved. We have Tel Leilan 2C period, which is what we call the post-Akkadian phase. This is it. This is the extent of the post-Akkadian phase. And it looks like squatter accommodation. These big palatial walls, regular people moved in and just built a house there, where we had never seen any sort of cooking implements or any sort of household wares. That's what you see now. In the palatial walls, it looks like there are some just regular people squatting in an abandoned palace. So what happened? Well, the curse of Akkad. The large fields and acres produced no grain. The flooded fields produced no fish. The watered gardens produced no honey and wine. The heavy clouds did not rain. On its plains where grew fine plants, lamentation reeds now grew. Remember this from the city gate? We have this hiatus period. Look at that. That is all wind-blown deposits. Phase 8, the Habur hiatus, you find this in multiple places around this part of northern Mesopotamia. You have an abandonment phase. So why? What's going on here? Well, remember, the Akkadian Empire was reliant upon rain-fed agriculture, but what happens if the rains stop? How many years can you go without rain? Well, the rivers still run, so the southern Mesopotamian cities will still at least have some ability to irrigate their agriculture. The rivers are still running, even if they're diminished capacity. You may have some problems, but you have a system where perennial rivers are still going to be perennial rivers. But if you have expansive agriculture out in the plains, and you're growing and you're relying upon the rain to fall, if it stops falling, how many years? 1 year, 2 years, 10 years? Well, it turns out 200 years took place. This was an abrupt climate event, what we call the 4.2 KABP event. And over this extent, we see disruption all over the place. This is the event right here. And you can see from various paleo-environmental records, there's this spike which show that there was a period of aridity and over a very wide area. This is from Gulf of Oman, Kilimanjaro, Sorek Cave, Dead Sea, Lake Van in Turkey, all over the place. And that corresponds very closely to our hiatus. So Harvey Weiss has argued that this 4.2 KABP abrupt climate event was a global event that had various impacts on cultures around the world. And that basically the Mediterranean westerly winds stopped blowing, stopped bringing their moisture, and stopped dumping it onto the Middle East for a period of a couple of hundred years. And so this was a global distribution of evidence that we have for this event. Now, does that mean that every society collapsed? No, apparently Urkesh, Tel Mozan had a reduced settlement, but they seem to have carried on. Maybe because they were somewhat independent from the Akkadian Empire, they were able to weather this drought, this very extended drought, for much longer than other places. And so here's some more of that proxy climate data from, and you can see where the collapse takes place right in that 4.2 KABP period there. And this is the period of Akkadian imperialization, and then you have the period of collapse. And this wasn't just Tel Leilan that this happened. This is the Akkadian period in the region. Tel Leilan Regional Survey showed the size and the location of sites. Tel Leilan's right in the middle of this map. And then you have this taking place in the post-Akkadian period. Basically, all settlements are abandoned. So what happened to people? Well, if there's no food and there's no empire that's keeping you safe and well fed, what do? You've got to find some way to survive. And so people probably became what we call transhumant. They probably just took to hoof. They started moving through the landscape. And there's even some ancient texts that talk about the Amorites, and the southern Mesopotamians constructed what they called the repeller of the Amorites' wall. And these were raiders that were just going on the hunt to try and scavenge what they could. And this would have coincided with what we see in terms of abandonment here. And then after that 200-year period, you see the repopulation of this area about 2000 BC in the Old Babylonian period. So as I said before, Tel Mosan might have weathered this storm a little bit. It was the capital of the Hurrian kingdom, and they retained their Hurrian autonomy and identity, and it seems as though they actually were able to keep their settlement together as well, and their kingdom together, albeit with probably some famine and reduction in settlement. There probably wasn't easy times for them, but they were able to weather this. But when you have an empire, remember what we talked about before. If your entire economy is based on centralizing production of one crop or two crops, barley and wheat, it all comes in. 40,000 liters coming in from one site to a central storeroom. That's great if it works, but if that's the only game in town, all it takes is drought for a few years, definitely over a couple hundred years, and your entire system collapse. You're not adaptable. And so this top-down control suddenly becomes a liability. You're not able to sort of adapt to local conditions. And then you have competition and people are fighting. So the end of the Akkadian Empire was marked by widespread abandonment in northern Mesopotamia, sending the population into transhumance, refugees and raiders flooding into southern Mesopotamia, and a 180 kilometer long repeller of the Amorites' wall, as I mentioned, was built to stem nomads from crossing into Ki Engir. At the same time, the Gutians and from the mountainous east defeated the Akkadian army, sacked Akkad, and destroyed it around 2100 BC. And so this is the curse of Akkad. Not necessarily Naram Sin calling himself a god, but him being the top of this very fragile imperial system. So that's my work that I've been doing on one of probably the world's earliest empire. And you can see there's a lot of nuance and subtleties to it. It's not just you flick on a switch and suddenly you have an empire, or you flip that switch off and suddenly the empire is gone. There's the evidence you've got to build just like any other case. And so I hope that this was an entertaining way to look into another aspect of the way that ancient cultures are extremely complex and rich, but also very interesting to look at. Thank you very much.